Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another mystery. Before we get started in this video, I just want to say a huge thank you because I am so close to 50,000 subscribers and you have no idea how much that means to me. Like, I think about 2012 Georgia, who used to watch YouTube in her bedroom and like was obsessed with Zoella and just wished she could lead that life, and now like I'm a YouTuber. I have 50,000 subscribers, nearly. I'm so close. So if you're not subscribed to me, then please make sure you click that subscribe button down below and help me get there. As soon as I hit 50,000, I'm going to do a whole mystery week. 5 days of mystery videos, solved, unsolved. Might even throw a serial killer video in there. Yeah, so make sure you click that subscribe button and stay tuned for that. So this week's mystery isn't as obscure, let's say, as some of the other mysteries I like to cover. A lot of people always tell me they like my channel because I do the mysteries that they haven't heard of before. You may have heard of this one before. This is quite a popular case, but it is such an interesting one that I just really wanted to share it with you guys. So this week we're going to be talking about the disappearance of a woman named Mary Shotwell Little. Mary went missing from Atlanta, Georgia on October 14th, 1965. She was 25 years old and she was a secretary at C&S Bank, and she was recently married. She got married about 6 weeks previously to her now husband, Roy Little. On the day that Mary went missing, October 14th, 1965, Roy was out of town. He also worked at a bank and he was training to become an auditor, so he had travelled to a town about 60 miles south of Atlanta and was basically going through his auditing training. Of course, Mary was at home alone, so the day she went missing, she went to work as usual, finished work, went to do her grocery shopping. She picked up about 4 bags worth of groceries and went to a place called Lenox Square to meet a co-worker for dinner. Her husband was away, so she took this opportunity to catch up with a friend. So they went to Lenox Square Shopping Centre and went to a place called the Piccadilly Cafeteria for dinner. Lenox Square Shopping Centre, at the time in the 60s in Atlanta, was one of the more sort of affluent shopping centres, shall we say. It was in a very wealthy area, it was full of expensive shops and posh restaurants, and it was just not the kind of place where women would go missing in broad daylight. Her co-worker has since said that there was nothing strange about her dinner with Mary that night. Mary was in very good spirits, she was talking happily about her married life. She just seemed to be in quite a happy place in life. At approximately 8 PM, so it wouldn't have been completely dark, but it would have been sort of maybe beginning to get dark, they walked back to the car park. They weren't parked in the same sort of area, so Mary walked back towards her car. It was a public, well-lit area. It wasn't exactly quiet. A lot of people were sort of leaving the restaurants after dinner. Mary's last words to her co-worker was "see you," which you would assume means see you tomorrow, but her co-worker never saw Mary again. People realised that something was amiss when Mary didn't turn up for work the next morning. Now, Mary was always very punctual, she was a good worker, and it was very unlike her not to turn up for work. So after quite a while and Mary hadn't turned up and they hadn't heard anything from her, her boss starts to worry a little bit. So her boss tries to call Mary's home line and Mary doesn't answer. And then he calls Mary's landlady and the landlady says she hasn't heard from Mary either. But Mary's newspaper hadn't been picked up that morning, meaning that she probably hadn't been home. Her colleagues and her boss started to worry even more. This was so unlike Mary not to turn up. They were trying to get hold of her husband, Roy, but like I said, Roy was out of town on work training and they couldn't get hold of him. So Mary's boss speaks to the colleague Mary was out for dinner with the previous night. And she sort of said whereabouts Mary was parked, what she'd last said to her, where she was last seen. So Mary's boss called Lenox Square Shopping Centre and asked security if they could see Mary's car in the car park. They say they can't. They both said that they'd arrived at work about 6 AM that morning, and I'm assuming the car park would have been pretty quiet at that time of day. So if they had seen Mary's car, which was a 1965, sorry I'm just going to read from here, 1965 metallic pearl grey Mercury Comet, they probably would have noticed it was there. But both the security guards on duty that morning saw that there was no car of that description in the car park. At midday, Mary's boss is frustrated about not hearing anything about Mary, so drives to Lenox Square car park himself. He drives around the car park for a few minutes and there, in broad daylight, spots Mary's car. The question here is, was the car there the whole time? Or was it taken and then brought back? Because the security guard swore that the car wasn't there. And there was also a patrol police officer driving through the car park that morning as well. And the same police officer also swore that the car was not there. The only explanation for that is that the car wasn't there at the time and that somebody had brought it back. Eventually they managed to get hold of Roy Little and he rushed back to Atlanta to find his wife. Mary's boss called the police and the police go to the scene of the crime. They go to Mary's car, and when they arrived at the car they found a very strange scene. Mary's car was covered in a thin layer of red dust, the exterior of it was, and it almost seemed as if Mary had been driving quite fast down a dirt track or a dirt road. Her 4 bags of groceries were inside from the grocery shopping she had done the previous night. There were also bottles of Coke and Kent cigarettes, which was Mary's preferred brand of cigarette. However, the most strange thing was the fact that Mary's underwear was placed on the middle console in the car between the 2 front seats. It had been neatly folded and placed on top of each other. In this pile were her slip, panties and a girdle, and lying on the floor of the car were her bra and a stocking, and the stocking looked like it had been cut with a knife. The underwear had been recently worn and they managed to confirm that it definitely belonged to Mary. It was also speckled with blood, and there was blood elsewhere in the car as well. Blood was found smeared on the steering wheel, on the driver's side door by the handle and the passenger side door by the window. Testing proved that it was most likely Mary's blood, but there wasn't much of it. The smearing made it seem like there was more than there was, but in reality it was just about the same amount as a small nosebleed. It definitely wasn't enough to suggest a fatal wound. The police also found a fingerprint in the blood on the steering wheel, but they've never been able to confirm if that fingerprint was Mary's or someone else's. At the time, a lot of police officers were actually convinced that the whole crime scene was staged. The fact that the blood was so smeared made it seem like it had been done on purpose, and everything just seemed a little bit out of place and very strange. The rest of Mary's clothes, her outer clothes, her coat, her car keys and her purse have never been found. By night time on October 15th, everyone in Atlanta knew about the story of this missing woman. And at the time, it was one of the biggest police investigations that the Atlanta Police Department had ever seen. It was huge and it was unprecedented. The original theory that the police worked on was that Mary had indeed been abducted. However, it seemed unlikely to police that Mary could have been overpowered in a well-lit car park at quite a busy time and nobody had seen. Not only would she have been overpowered, she would also have been forced to strip down and take off her underwear. Due to this, police did believe that the car had been taken out of the car park and then returned the next day. They theorised that somebody had been waiting at her car, maybe threatened her with a knife or with a gun and made her get into the passenger seat. They drove her out of the car park, maybe sexually assaulted her and murdered her, and then returned the car to the car park the next morning. But still, this seems strange. Why would somebody go to the effort of returning the car, risking being caught? But also, why would they not clean the car properly? They left the blood smears and they left her underwear very clearly folded in the middle of the car. The police's next port of call in this investigation was to look into Mary's personal life. And although she was newly married and seemed to be very happy, not everything was as carefree as you may have thought. It turns out that Mary had a, let's say, secret admirer. She had received roses from somebody unknown and she was receiving worrying phone calls at work. She never discussed the phone calls with anyone, but her co-workers had heard enough to wonder who was on the other end. She was heard on the phone saying, "I'm a married woman now," and also, very strangely, she was heard saying, "You can come over to my house anytime you like, but I can't come over there." She had also expressed concerns to a friend a few weeks earlier that she was worried about being home alone. She didn't like being home alone, and particularly she didn't like being in her car alone. Now obviously that's a very strange way to feel, but her friend said she didn't think much of it at the time, didn't think to question it. It was only after Mary went missing that this became concerning. Now I know what you're probably all thinking. Her husband Roy is quite an obvious suspect here. You always look at boyfriends, husbands first. But Roy actually had a rock solid alibi. Like I said, he was in a town about 60 miles south of Atlanta training for his work. He was with a lot of people, loads of people saw him there at the time that Mary went missing. He did not have anything directly to do anyway with Mary's disappearance. The police never saw him as a suspect, even for a second. However, he did act strangely after Mary disappeared. He never seemed to publicly care that much, shall we say. He never really expressed any emotions. Throughout the investigation, he seemed more concerned about getting his car back than he did with Mary disappearing. He also refused to do multiple lie detector tests, which I suppose because he had a rock solid alibi, he wouldn't have been seen as a suspect anyway, but at the same time I think, why refuse to do it? Or maybe he was just scared that the results would come up wrong? I don't really know. Everyone around Mary and Roy knew that they were happily married. They were both like so happy with each other, and he would have had no motive to do this. But I do want to quickly address the fact that he never seemed to care that much about Mary's appearance in public or show any emotions. I think, as suspicious and strange as that is, you've got to remember that this was a different time. This was back in the 1960s. Even nowadays, a lot of people for some reason see it as weak when men show emotions or get upset, and I can only imagine that would have been heightened back in the 1960s when it was all about the man being the man of the household. I think it was a very different time, and I think it's easy to say now looking back that it was very odd and suspicious of Roy to show no emotions, but I think you've got to bear in mind the time period as well. So like I said, this was a huge police investigation to the point that the FBI got involved. There was evidence that Mary had travelled state lines, meaning that it now wasn't something just for the Atlanta Police Department, it was a federal offence. The Atlanta Police Department had more manpower on this case than any case in history. That is how big this was. A month into the investigation, the police actually get their first lead. They find evidence that Mary's credit card was used in a gas station in Charlotte, North Carolina. And soon after, they discovered that her credit card had also been used at a gas station in Raleigh, North Carolina. So her credit card was first used in Charlotte in the early hours of the 15th. I think it was around 2 a.m. The lead detective on the case was a man called Jack Perry, and him and an assistant went straight to Charlotte to interview the gas station attendants that would have spoken to Mary. When they got there, they got the receipt, and the receipt bore Mary's signature. Her signature read Mrs. Roy H. Little Jr. And from as far as everyone's always been able to tell, it was Mary's handwriting. They've always been pretty convinced that it was definitely Mary that signed this slip, and the gas station confirmed that it was indeed a woman that signed this. All of the attendants that Jack Perry spoke to clearly remembered the woman and this incident. It wasn't something that they could easily forget about. In Charlotte, the attendant remembered a woman with a cut on her head, and she was bleeding quite a lot. She was also trying to hide her face, and a man was giving her orders. Now, I have read conflicting articles about this. One of them said that Mary stayed in the car. She was trying to hide her face and she had this cut, and the only time she sort of did anything was to sign the credit card slip. Another article I read said that she actually got out of the car and was sort of standing there trying to hide herself. Either way, it was definitely suspicious. In Charlotte, she was with a man, and the man was barking orders at her, and she seemed quite scared. In Raleigh, it was a similar situation. She was covered in blood. This attendant even said she had blood running down her legs. And she was actually this time with 2 men, and both of these men were barking orders at her. Now, police found the timings of these 2 separate incidents very strange. From what it seems, Mary was taken around 8 p.m. on October 14th. She was spotted in Charlotte at about 2 a.m. and then she was spotted in Raleigh about midday. So that's a long time between these 2 incidents. However, at the time, it would have only taken about 3.5 to 4 hours to drive from Charlotte to Raleigh. So what were they doing for that amount of time? You would think that if they've abducted Mary, they would have her constantly on the move. They would want to get as far away from Atlanta as possible. But it seems like they stopped somewhere for quite a significant amount of time. Something else very interesting here is that Charlotte, North Carolina is actually Mary's hometown. It's where she grew up, it's where her parents still lived. And it seems very, very risky to take Mary to a place where there's a huge chance that she would have been recognised. Somebody very possibly could have seen her. To me, this screams that it was a random attack and that the attackers probably didn't know that Mary was from Charlotte, otherwise it may not have taken her there. Or it could be the complete opposite. It could be that they knew that Mary was from Charlotte and then took her there to kind of taunt her. Detectives just couldn't piece this case together. Another question they asked themselves was, at what point was the car switched? Now, we know that at midday that day, Mary's car was in that car park at Lenox Square. But also at that time, Mary was seen in North Carolina. And I am inclined to believe that the security guards are correct and that the car wasn't there at 6 a.m. that morning. So where had the car gone in that time, and who returned it? If Mary was with 2 men in North Carolina at midday, who was taking the car back to the car park? This suggests that it was a huge operation and there were a lot of people involved. Now, Roy Little actually kept a very, very detailed mileage log on this car, and he noted down all the miles that it did. However, when the police compared these logs to the miles the car had actually done, there were 41 miles that were totally unaccounted for. So this suggests that the car had been driven for 41 miles before being returned to the car park. Another odd angle here is reports that a license plate that was stolen from Charlotte, North Carolina was seen on a car. Now I say a car because some reports said that Mary's license plate was switched. When the police found it in the car park, it was the stolen license plate. But some other reports I read said that it was actually the car which was seen with Mary at the gas station in Charlotte had this stolen license plate. I can't figure out which way it is. I am more inclined to believe that it was the license plate on the car in Charlotte because I think that makes more sense. Unless somebody's really trying to mess with the police, I don't see why they would change the license plate on Mary's car. It makes more sense for them to change a license plate on a car which is carrying an abducted woman. But this license plate was stolen from Charlotte, which again links back to the fact that it was Mary's hometown and the abductors were probably closely linked with Charlotte as well. Was this somebody that Mary had known for a long time? Police couldn't get a solid description of the man that Mary had been seen with. He was just very generic. He had dark hair, he was white. Very, very generic descriptions from both gas station attendants that spoke to them. But police did figure out a kind of psychological profile of this man, and the kind of man they were looking for was terrifying to them. This is a man who took crazy, bizarre risks like returning Mary's car to the car park it had been stolen from and taking Mary to her hometown and parading her in front of gas station attendants. Why these attendants didn't think anything more suspicious at the time of a woman with blood running out of her head and having orders barked at her, I don't know. Maybe if the attendants had called the police straight away, then Mary would have been found. But this man was reckless and he was crazy clever, and he was also clearly unafraid of getting caught. This is kind of the hallmarks of a sociopath. And the case hit a complete dead end. All tips led nowhere. The police were stumped, they had nothing. Now let's talk about some other strange things that happened in the years to follow in the investigation. I feel like this part isn't going to flow as nicely as I would expect it to, but these are just like little tidbits of information which pertain to the case. So in 1966, an FBI agent actually conducted an interview with an inmate in a Georgia prison. The man, who is now dead, told this FBI agent an elaborate story about two men in Atlanta who told him that they had been paid $5,000 each to kidnap a woman named Mary. They said they took her to a small greenhouse in a place called Mount Holly, and they later killed her. Obviously, this is a very strange story and investigators did look into it, but it was yet another dead end. They couldn't take the word of a convict in prison for 100% truth because they had no proof that it was true. They had no evidence. It was just his word of mouth. He could have just been bored in prison and was trying to make his life a little bit more interesting, let's say. But investigators did go to Mount Holly and they looked for this greenhouse with a porch wrapped around it, and they did find a house that matched this description. However, of course, it had been demolished. Yet another dead end. In 2009, the Homicide Department in Atlanta did a full review of this case, and bear in mind we now have new forensics and we have new technology that could help with this case. No progress was made at all. I did also read something, and I'm not 100% sure if this is true, but I read that all of the files pertaining to Mary Shotwell Little's disappearance have actually vanished. They've been lost. But I'm not sure if that is before this police review in 2009 or if it was after it, and I'm not even sure if that's legit information, but I did definitely read that a couple of times. So now we're going to talk about another case. In May 1967, a woman called Diane Shields, who was the woman who took over Mary's job at C&S Bank, was found dead. She was working in this job still at C&S Bank when she died. She had actually recently left there and was now working in another office, but I think it is important information to know that she was the woman who took over Mary's job. At about 2:30 AM, the day after Diane went missing, her car was found, and in the boot of her car was Diane's body. She was found with a scarf and some paper shoved down her throat. She had suffocated to death. She was fully clothed and she hadn't been sexually assaulted, meaning that rape wasn't the motive here. And she also had her diamond engagement ring still on her finger, meaning that robbery wasn't the motive either. This case also remains unsolved, and it has been speculated by the police department that Mary's disappearance and Diane's murder are linked. Weirdly enough though, after a detective went on TV and said that he thinks these two cases are linked, this detective actually received a call from Mary's mother, and this was about 1.5 years after Mary's disappearance, and Mary's mother said, "Leave it, I don't want Mary's case looked into anymore," which is just very strange. I know people do deal with grief in different ways, but if your daughter's disappeared, you want to get an answer. You don't want to tell the police department that they need to leave it now. Of course the police department didn't leave it. It was a federal offence. She was probably murdered. They couldn't just stop investigating it because her mother said so. So I'm just gonna like dip into some different theories because really nobody knows what happened here. And one of the theories is that the crime scene was completely staged, either by Mary or by somebody else. Maybe Mary was actually unhappy in her marriage and wanted to escape and saw this as an opportunity to do so. However, this doesn't quite match up to the fact that she was seen with blood all down her. It doesn't match the fact that she was with 2 men. If she was going to disappear, you think she'd only enlist the help of 1 person to save it being found out. It just doesn't match up that Mary would have done this because for all intents and purposes she was happily married. But a lot of people have said that because Roy seemed totally unbothered by her disappearance and Mary's mother said to stop looking into the disappearance, that maybe they both know that it was staged and that Mary just ran away. Another theory is that Mary was having an affair and ran away to be with this other person. People say that this links to the phone call she was receiving saying she's a married woman now. To me, the fact that she was speaking to this person on the phone and said, "You can come to mine but I can't come to yours," suggests that it wasn't an affair, because if it was an affair, Mary would be sneaking around going to their place, not telling them to come to her place where her husband was most likely there. To me, this says more that she is scared of this person and so wants them to come to her place where her husband will be, so her husband can be there to protect her. I think personally I'm most inclined to believe the fact that Mary did have a secret admirer, this person on the phone, the person who was sending her flowers, she was scared to be home alone. I think whoever this person is the one who did this to her. And I do think it was probably somebody from her hometown, maybe somebody she grew up with in Charlotte, didn't like the fact she was now married and just set out to hurt her. Another thing I want to touch on in this case is the fact that C&S Bank did actually have a former FBI agent investigating something that was happening at the bank around the time of Mary's disappearance. Apparently there was a small prostitution ring and lesbian sexual assault going on in the bank. However, Mary's boss has always insisted that it was a minor scandal and they just got the FBI agent in to try and like nip it in the bud. And her boss has actually always said that Mary knew nothing about it. However, people have said that Mary definitely did know about it because she spoke to them. I don't think it was anything massive here. I just think it was a bit of office gossip. I would be shocked if it was something that was linked to Mary's murder. But a lot of people do think that because Diane, the woman who took over Mary's job, was also found murdered, that it could definitely be a link. And I'm not denying it could be. But I do think that it's quite an obvious red herring in this case. I think it is something that police would focus on rather than actually trying to find out what really did happen to Mary. To me, it just doesn't match up. I think it would just been a minor scandal, a bit of office gossip. I don't think it would have been something that Mary would have been murdered over. I think something more suspicious that happened in the office is the fact that she was receiving these strange phone calls from someone. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that this was lesbian sexual harassment. It was between women apparently, and she was clearly taken by a man. At one point shortly after Mary's disappearance, Roy, her husband, received a phone call demanding a $20,000 ransom for Roy to meet him in this place and they would exchange money and he'd get Mary back. It's widely believed this is a hoax. Roy actually sent an FBI agent in his place, and when the FBI agent arrived it was just a blank piece of paper pinned to a tree. Possibly could be something, but I think in a lot of these cases there are always hoaxes, and it was probably just somebody trying to mess with the investigation. I don't really think it would be anything too serious. Something else to bear in mind, sorry I feel like this is all over the place, but there's just so many other tidbits of information I need to share. In the car park shortly before Mary went missing at Lenox Square, another woman was approached by a man who sort of tapped on her window and said that her back tyre was flat. The woman luckily didn't roll down her window or anything, just kind of drove away and drove to the nearest gas station where she checked her tyres and realised they were all totally fine. I do think this is very suspicious. In the space of 10 minutes in this car park, 2 women, well, this woman and potentially Mary, have been approached. Maybe Mary wasn't as smart to just continue driving, maybe she fell for it, and it was just a completely random attack. So let's have a quick run through of the theories here because I feel like that was all just a bit messy. Mary was attacked by a complete stranger, it was random, it was just unlucky that she was there at the same time that this person was. Number 2 is that she was attacked by a secret admirer, maybe somebody, a former lover from Charlotte, and they didn't like the fact she was now married and wanted them all to herself. Number 3 is that it could be linked to the scandal at her workplace, and her death/disappearance could be linked to that of Diane Shields. Number 4 is that she did it herself and that she was unhappy in her marriage and just wanted to run away. Number 5 could be that Roy did have something to do with it. Maybe he found out that Mary was having an affair, or found out about the secret admirer and got jealous, and maybe he hired people to hurt her. But it's worth saying that for none of these theories is there any evidence whatsoever. This is a complete dead-end case. The police have nothing. But out of those 5 theories, or if you've got any other theories, I'll be really interested to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this, please make sure you give it a thumbs up and make sure you click that subscribe button to get me to that 50k. Yay! And yeah, I will see you in next week's video. Bye guys.